It now gives me great pleasure to move to our next keynote speaker, who, as I said before, is Mike Foster, who's Head of Economic Development and Climate Change at the British High Commission in Nairobi. And he's going to examine how government, civil society and business can work more closely together to meet the economic challenges of COVID-19. So over to you, Mike. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nicholas. Thank you for inviting me to speak, and thanks to everyone else for taking the time to listen as well. I'm hoping you can hear me okay, so I'm just going to carry on. So the topic for this session is basically how different sections of society, whether that's government, civil society or business, can and should work together to meet the economic challenges of COVID-19. While my own experience of the pandemic has been quite heavily shaped by the Kenya context, I think a lot of it applies to the region more broadly. Although I definitely welcome perspectives perhaps in the chat bar from elsewhere in the region. Tanzania, for example, I think stands out as a somewhat similar economy, which definitely took a very different approach to management of the pandemic during the course of 2020, albeit the country's changed tack somewhat under the new administration there. So this session is focused on the economic impacts of COVID-19. Because as much as the pandemic has been a global health emergency, we should be clear it's also been a global economic emergency. Worldwide, about 3 million people have died, and roughly $3 trillion was wiped from global GDP. In Kenya specifically, 5,000 people lost their lives, but at the peak, 5 million people had lost their jobs. That's the consequences of a $5 billion hit to GDP. Employment among Kenya's adult population fell from about 71% before the pandemic to 50% at the lows, and it's yet to fully recover. Currently, it's about 66%, according to the statistics from the World Bank. I think in some ways there's been a bit of a trade-off between those two outcomes. In large part, the economic damage was done by measures that were designed to limit the scale of infections, hospitalizations, and crucially deaths. For example, the global restrictions on international travel have completely decimated the tourism industry in places like Kenya. Previously, that accounted for about 10% of GDP, probably supported incomes for about 2 million people. In a typical July, Kenya would have 160,000 international visitors. Last July, I think we had almost exactly zero. And that's obviously devastating for all the people who rely on that industry for their incomes. I think even more importantly, there was potential for domestic restrictions to do even greater damage, particularly in countries like Kenya with a high proportion of informal jobs. In the global north, lockdowns forced a lot of people to maybe switch their office jobs for a laptop at the kitchen table. That was inconvenient, especially if you had homeschooling of children as well, but your salary kept coming. If you couldn't work from home, there was a good chance you could access generous government support through a furlough scheme or some other mechanism. But for the vast majority of citizens in Africa, neither of those was a feasible option. In Kenya, somewhere between 80 and 90% of jobs are informal, and they rely very heavily on physical interaction between people. Nairobi's border riders haven't really got the option of working from home, and they wouldn't be able to access a government furlough scheme even if Kenya could afford one, which of course it can't. The nature of Kenya's employment market and the fragility of household finances here means there's not really a simple trade-off between health and economic impacts. The collapse in informal incomes led really directly to a significant increase in poverty and hunger, which has, apart from anything else, got quite a significant health impact itself. Some research from FSD Kenya during the sort of first few months of the pandemic last year found that the proportion of Kenyan adults missing meals had risen really dramatically by about sort of 15 to 20%. So in a developing, highly informal economy like Kenya, but also others in the region, I think there's a really serious risk that COVID measures designed to protect Kenyans actually did more harm than good. That was a difficult balance to strike, frankly, for all governments. But in general, it's one that we think the government of Kenya actually handled relatively well. Suspended movement across county lines, and that really helped to slow the spread of the virus from urban centres where it was quite prevalent, and kept it out of the more rural areas, certainly slowed the spread. And that was important because the rural areas is where the majority of Kenya's more elderly and vulnerable population live. But within sort of those urban centres, restrictions on movement were actually calibrated to allow quite a lot of economic activity to continue. Rather than blanket lockdowns, measures were targeted at particularly at higher risk activities that brought a large number of people together. Most obviously, business at nightclubs in Nairobi was quite severely hampered by a sort of a curfew regime, which is still in place today. I think it's also important to highlight the steps that the government of Kenya took to ensure it was actively listening to employers, and it was quite pragmatic about adjusting policy to help businesses keep doing business during the pandemic. For example, I'd highlight the sort of business situation room, which was established by the Cabinet Secretary for Industry and Trade here. That was a really effective forum for the government to engage business and basically established a feedback loop to policy making that really helped. For example, it resulted in kind of new operating procedures that allowed various industries to reopen on kind of COVID compliant terms. And that helped to really mitigate the impact on employment and incomes. Equally, we also had a Kazi Mtani program, which was led by our sort of State Department for Housing and Urban Development here in Kenya. And that provided a really important focus on the impact of the pandemic on Kenya's informal urban settlements. That was a partnership between government and civil society groups that led to the introduction of some really important new policy initiatives, particularly in terms of short-term local job creation to help offset some of the impacts. So those are two, I think, really good examples of evidence-based and adaptive policymaking in quite real time that help to mitigate the economic impacts of COVID-19 here, and which actually the UK government is really proud to support it through some of our funding for that expert policy analysis and the advice that supported the government decision making. But while the policy response in Kenya has relatively been pretty strong, we should be clear the economic damage has been really severe. In addition to that huge collapse in informal employment, the collapse in GDP had a really severe fiscal impact. And it's come at a particularly challenging time for Kenya. Sovereign debt here has grown really substantially in recent years, and that limits the capacity for further borrowing. Much of that new debt came with initial grace periods, which are expiring right now. And that means that Kenya's facing really increased debt servicing costs, just as COVID-19 has reduced the size of the tax base. The fact that Kenyan elections are now less than a year away is also going to present some of its own challenges in terms of delivering the sort of fiscal restraint that Kenya is going to need to repair its public finances. That's going to be, I think, a really long road back for whoever occupies State House after the 2022 elections. And it's also the backdrop to the recently agreed IMF package. That's a multi-billion-dollar bailout, and it buys Kenya time to balance its books, but it's not going to buy large-scale pump priming through public investment. Kenya's got government debt now just over 70% of GDP. So it's going to need to find a new model for financing investment that doesn't load sort of further borrowing onto the sovereign balance sheet, because that really can't bear anymore. We think that mobilizing private investment is going to be critical. So I think there's positive signs that the Kenyan government is kind of seized at that fact. I point in particular to the really sort of rejuvenation of the National Treasury's approach to public-private partnerships, which has been led by a new Director General brought in from the private sector, specifically from Standard Chartered Bank. That's already seen a fairly radical overhaul of Kenya's sort of framework for PPPs to make them more attractive to private investors. And the UK government stepped in to support that effort with some funding for technical assistance that will help to structure those investments, bring them to financial close. And we think that will create a more financially sustainable model for public infrastructure in Kenya compared to one that relies entirely on ever-increasing sovereign borrowing. It's a much more complicated endeavour than simply signing up a project developer with comes with a pre-arranged bundle of sort of loans to the government, especially if those defer costs to another day, maybe even another administration. But we think this slightly more difficult, more complicated path is a necessity for Kenya if it's going to raise finance for continued investment in public infrastructure. That finance is just going to have to come from the private sector. So I think it's fair to say that partnerships between government and business are going to be really vital to filling Kenya's infrastructure gap. But more widely, I think the government's also going to need to look to the private sector to drive job creation. We've got almost 1 million young Kenyans coming into the job market each year. So this is creating jobs for them is a really urgent challenge. The good news is we know Kenya actually is a really dynamic, it's a very entrepreneurial society. And it's capable of, fantastic innovation and really rapid adoption of new technologies and business models. I think a great example is digital finance, where, Kenya's really leapfrogged many much more advanced economies in how it's adopted that. And I think it promises to do the same in other areas. In particular, I think I'd highlight the potential for Kenya to be a real pioneer in a field like green manufacturing. Manufacturing is one of the president's big 4 priorities here. So Kenya benefits from a serious government commitment to rapid growth in that sector. And Kenya is also home to some sort of pretty well-established firms who are well positioned to grow domestically and potentially expand across the region. I think the real significance, though, is that Kenya is looking to expand its manufacturing base at actually quite an auspicious moment in history. Partly that's about relative competitiveness between East Africa and East Asia, where costs have been sort of rising steadily over the years. And so I think to a certain extent, COVID promises to accelerate that trend. When you've had trade-related disruptions, I think on the whole, that will probably convince some firms to shorten their global supply chains for sort of feeding into Europe. But I think more excitingly, it's about a bigger shift in terms of the development and sort of increased bankability of some manufacturing models that are much greener than what's come before. Partly that's about inputs, so reduced costs of clean energy, better technologies for reclaimed materials as an input into production. But it's also about the nature of the products, things like electric vehicles. So I think electric vehicles, in a lot of ways, if you're sat in the West, I think they seem like quite a high-tech, expensive version of the green economy. Definitely, if you popped into a Tesla showroom in West London, the prices would suggest that they are. But actually, I think we see quite a compelling business case here in Kenya for the adoption of electric vehicles and sort of two-wheelers by things like Nairobi's Boda drivers. Powered by exchangeable batteries. I think those promise to raise incomes, we think, by about 1/3 because they're cheaper to run, and at the same time reducing emissions as well. So, a long way from the Tesla showrooms in West London, we think electric vehicles actually could prove to be quite a valuable and quite an inclusive segment of the green economy here in Kenya. And that sort of takes me to, I think, my final and probably my most important point about the economic recovery from COVID. And that's about the choice that we make about the kind of economy that we want to rebuild. Globally, all governments are going to have to make quite an active choice about whether to rebuild a sort of business as usual economy that locks the world into continued emissions growth and accelerating climate change, or whether they try and build back better from the pandemic and pursue an economic recovery that's cleaner and more resilient as well. I think for most of our lifetimes, that argument has been generally framed as sort of climate versus development, and that was, based on an assumption that a developing country, if it tried to pursue a green economic model, it would necessarily be at the expense of lower growth, right? But I think we've had some really interesting recent advances in technology and also kind of increased scale of production, which have really changed the economic arguments. Things like the collapse in the cost of renewable energy. And that's turned the kind of economic debate on its head a little bit. Those economic arguments are now quite firmly in favor of the green economy, and the economic risks related to fossil fuels are becoming more evident. In particular, the risk that any economy that doesn't adapt could quite easily find itself locked into an obsolete model with some really significant exposure to stranded fossil fuel assets that will turn out to have been quite bad investments. Just over 6 weeks, I think it is, maybe 6 or 7 weeks, the UK is going to welcome the world to COP26 in Glasgow. And that's a moment that many are seeing as the last chance for our planet and our economies to avoid the worst consequences of catastrophic climate change. That summit comes at a moment also when countries are finally starting to look beyond the pandemic and start to think quite seriously about how they rebuild the economies. And I would hope that Kenya and other countries in the region will use that moment to really think quite seriously and seize the opportunities offered by a green industrial revolution. None of that is going to be easy. Mobilizing private finance into public infrastructure is going to be complex. Leapfrogging to novel modes of green production is going to feel quite risky. And we should be clear that COVID-19 is going to be with us for quite a long time yet, particularly in Africa, where vaccination rates lag far behind a lot of the world. So delivering on all that is going to require an effort, I think, across the whole of society, government, business, civil society. But I'm going to suggest that those shifts are not just desirable, but also pretty much mandatory if we're going to lay sustainable foundations for future prosperity. So at that point, I think I'd like to, I'll maybe pause and maybe open the session up to comments or questions in the sidebar, and very happy to take those, particularly Chris from Leeds in the UK, if you could give my love to West Yorkshire. Thank you.
Much, Mike. I'm not sure if we've got any questions for you, but I just wanted to say that I found your insight into a sort of cleaner, more sustainable recovery very interesting. Green manufacturing is something that I personally take an interest in, and electric vehicles. And I know what you're talking about in terms of Kenya's leapfrogging in digital finance. This is something that's been quite spectacular. You're absolutely right, I think, with your summing up of the fact that new initiatives need to be engaged rather than relying on sovereign borrowing all the time. If we have got one question, I think. Hang on a second. Let's have a look. Oh, here we are. It's in the sidebar. I think you can see it actually, Mike, can't you?
Yeah, interesting. So, yeah, do you generate emissions in the production of solar panels? So, I mean, I think the important question. This actually, there's a wider point here, I think, which is about kind of which bits of your economy you shift to clean energy, right? So I think the sort of the situation in Kenya actually is really interesting, where you've got incredibly high sort of use of renewable energy in the grid. So last year, roughly 90% of power in the grid was from renewable sources. We've got solar, we've got geothermal, and we've got quite a lot of wind as well. But actually, and I think this is kind of where the question is going, a lot of the sort of industrial, more manufacturing stuff, yes, it will kind of use some grid power, but also quite a lot of off-grid generators get used as well, because the power can be intermittent. Not particularly that Kenya is manufacturing a lot of solar panels, but I think the wider point is, how do you migrate that sort of those heavier industries, that manufacturing capacity onto solar, for example. And I think that's something that we're very focused on. I think partly it's about grid reliability. So a lot of the intermittency that you see in the Kenyan market is not actually to do with a shortage of power and sort of blackouts or brownouts. It's more to do with the transmission grid itself. So there's definitely some investment needed there. But I think also we think there's a really big opportunity actually in replacing the sort of the backup diesel generators that power sort of manufacturing plants with sort of off-grid solar installations, because that's I think quite an important part of the energy picture that's not really been kind of greened yet in Kenya. And I think the wider point, to go back to the question here, is you definitely need to be greening your manufacturing sector here, because it sort of absorbs an awful lot of power generation, but also there would be a certain irony if solar panels were being manufactured using energy from a diesel generator. Thanks.
Great, thanks for that, Mike. There's also a question from Dubai, from NRS relief manufacturers of shelter products. They say, do you see any chance to have zero emission legislation or obligation for companies or agencies to at least have a zero emission plan in the humanitarian sector? Well, so I mean, this is something that I think is actually quite timely. So definitely, as we're looking towards COP in early November, one of the big questions there is, how many countries around the world will come forward with a strategy for getting to net zero emissions. And definitely we're optimistic that a large chunk of the global economy will come forward with that strategy and that commitment. Even in Kenya, President Kenyatta has publicly said that he'll produce a net zero strategy by COP, which we're very excited about. So I think that there is sort of quite a sustained political imperative from the top for economies to get there. I think different sectors will be on different timelines. But I think
Yeah, I do think that is coming. I think it will be at a different pace. So I think manufacturing is something that will be quite a big sort of impact in terms of just because of the amount of energy it absorbs. The humanitarian sector specifically, I wouldn't have thought was a colossal source of emissions. And I don't think it will be a case that every sector is required to get to zero. It will be more be a case of how does the economy as a whole get to net zero, and depending on things like your forest cover, which and the absorptive capacity of that in carbon, that will create different sort of amounts of space for sort of other industries to maybe move a little bit more slowly. But I think the wider point is actually it's not necessarily about the cost of getting there. I think the economics have shifted so much on things like clean power that it's just going to make more sense, and increasingly more sense as the world shifts. Because the economies of scale will be in favour of solar panels and electric vehicles rather than diesel generators and diesel 4x4s.
Very good. Thank you very much. Well, look, thank you, Mike, for your contribution to our webinar. This has been really helpful. I just want to say to the audience that our next session will be at 10:30. 12:30 Kenyan time, and it will be how can mobile technology help support Kenya's struggling healthcare system. So I hope quite a few of you will join that. Thanks again to Mike, and we'll see you all later on. Thank you.